Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. I hope you all are doing well. Today we need to talk about a single body of water which is just a few kilometers wide at its narrowest point that holds the key to the entire global economy. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and seeing petrol prices shoot up overnight. Airline tickets suddenly become more expensive. Stock markets start falling, food prices begin creeping higher. And all of this happens because of a narrow stretch of water that most people have never even heard of. A waterway so important that many experts consider it the most critical energy choke point on Earth. This place is called the Strait of Hormuz, and right now, as tensions continue to rise in the Middle East, one question keeps coming up. What happens if Iran decides to close it? Could oil prices explode? Could it trigger a global economic crisis? And most importantly, what would it mean for countries like India? Let's find out. At first glance, the Strait of Hormuz doesn't look very impressive. It is simply a narrow passage of water located between Iran and Oman. But this small waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea and ultimately to the rest of the world. And that's exactly why it matters. Some of the world's largest oil producing countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran itself, depend on this route to export their energy. Every single day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through this narrow passage. That's about 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil consumed worldwide. Think about that for a moment. A huge portion of the world's energy supply passes through a waterway that, at its narrowest point, is only about 39 kilometers wide. And it's not just oil. Massive amount of liquefied natural gas, also known as LNG, also move through this route, especially from Qatar, one of the world's largest gas exporters. In other words, this isn't just a waterway, it is one of the main arteries of the global economy. And if that artery gets blocked, the consequences could spread everywhere. Now, when people hear the phrase close the Strait of Hormuz, they often imagine Iran physically blocking the entire waterway. But that's not really how it works. Iran doesn't need to build a wall across the sea. It simply needs to make the area dangerous enough that commercial ships stop using it. There are several ways that could happen. Iran has coastal missile systems positioned along its shoreline. It operates naval forces, fast attack boats, drones, and potentially sea mines. Even a few incidents involving commercial vessels could dramatically increase the perceived risk. And once that happens, shipping companies face a difficult choice. Do they continue operating in a potentially dangerous zone, or do they stay away entirely? The moment insurance companies start raising premiums and shipping firms begin rerouting vessels, global supply chains feel the impact. So technically, Iran doesn't need to completely shut the strait down. It only needs to convince the world that it is no longer safe. If news broke tomorrow that shipping through the strait had stopped, the first reaction would be panic. Not on the battlefield, in the financial markets. Oil traders would immediately begin pricing in the possibility of a major supply shortage. And when it comes to commodity markets, fear can move prices almost as quickly as actual shortages. Oil prices would likely surge, stock markets could fall, airline companies would come under pressure. Investors would rush towards assets traditionally seen as safe, such as gold. And all of this could happen within hours, before a single barrel of oil is actually lost. Because markets don't wait for a crisis to happen, they react to what they think might happen next. Here is where things become serious. The world consumes more than 100 million barrels of oil every day, and around 20 million of those barrels normally travel through the Strait of Hormuz. That is an enormous amount of energy moving through one narrow passage. Now, some Gulf countries do have alternative export routes. Saudi Arabia and the UAE can redirect some oil through pipelines, but those alternatives can only handle a portion of the total volume. They simply cannot replace everything that moves through Hormuz. That means millions of barrels per day could effectively disappear from the market. And when supply drops, while demand remains relatively unchanged, prices rise, sometimes dramatically. Some analysts have suggested that in an extreme scenario, oil prices could surge well beyond $150 per barrel and potentially approach $200 per barrel. And once oil becomes expensive, the effect spreads everywhere. Transportation costs rise, manufacturing costs rise, agricultural costs rise. Eventually, everyday consumers start paying more for almost everything. Most people focus on oil, but there is another problem that often gets overlooked: natural gas. Qatar is one of the world's largest exporters of LNG, and most of those exports travel through the Strait of Hormuz. If that flow is interrupted, countries across Asia and Europe could face serious challenges. Electricity generation becomes more expensive. Industries that depend on gas face higher costs. Governments may have to compete for limited supplies, and energy prices could rise across multiple sectors simultaneously. This is why experts don't view Hormuz as simply an oil story. It is an energy story, and energy affects everything. Now let's bring the discussion closer to home. Why should India care about a waterway thousands of kilometers away? The answer is simple. India imports most of the crude oil it consumes, and a significant portion of that oil comes from the Gulf region. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes unusable, India's energy imports could become more expensive almost immediately. Petrol and diesel prices could rise, air travel could become costlier, inflation could increase. Industries that rely heavily on transportation and fuel could face higher operating costs. And ultimately, consumers would feel the impact. Even if alternative sources of oil are found, those supplies are likely to be more expensive, which means the average Indian household could end up paying the price for a crisis taking place far away. Now, the important question is, could this trigger a global recession? It's possible. Modern economies run on energy. When energy prices rise sharply, economic growth often slows. Businesses spend more, consumers spend more, governments face inflationary pressure, and investors become increasingly nervous. If oil prices remain elevated for an extended period, the effects could ripple across the global economy. Supply chains become more expensive, transportation becomes more expensive, manufacturing becomes more expensive, and that combination can put significant pressure on economic growth worldwide. That's why governments monitor the Strait of Hormuz so closely, because what happens there doesn't stay there. Would the world allow it to happen? The short answer: probably not for very long. The Strait of Hormuz is simply too important. Major powers have a strong interest in keeping global shipping lanes open. If traffic through the strait were seriously disrupted, diplomatic efforts would intensify almost immediately. Military presence in the region would likely increase. Countries could release emergency oil reserves. Alternative export routes would be used wherever possible. But even with all of these measures, replacing the full capacity of Hormuz would be extremely difficult in the short term. And that's exactly why the strait remains one of the world's most strategically important locations. The Strait of Hormuz may look like a tiny strip of water on a map, but in reality, it helps power the modern world. Every day, millions of barrels of oil and vast quantities of natural gas pass through this narrow passage. If Iran were ever able to close it, the consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East. Oil prices could surge, energy markets could be disrupted, and economies around the world, including India's, could feel the impact. Which is why this small waterway continues to command the attention of the world leaders, military planners, economists, and investors alike. Because sometimes the fate of the global economy depends on a place that barely stands out on a map, and the Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.